What's going on, everybody? Kung here. In this video I'm going to be talking about how to plan your passive tree in Path of Exile. If you're a brand new player to Path of Exile, this is not your video. I'd encourage you to go check out a lot of the other resources that are out there for beginners. However, if you're an intermediate player, you've played Path of Exile and you have some degree of familiarity and you're interested in making your own builds and characters, this is your video. And so before you even look at the passive tree, the first thing that you need to have in mind and have thought about is a big idea that's driving your build. What is it that you're wanting to accomplish with this character that you're designing? And one of the things that I've noticed when I looked across lots of builds and read how people came up with them is they really sort of came from three major categories. So one of these categories was that the big idea was some novel or new idea that didn't really exist before. And so example of this would be the recent discovered interaction between the Taming and Emberwake and how they synergize very well in stacking ignites and using that to be able to scale the damage through one of the properties of the Taming. And so a second big idea that I've seen is an interesting item or skill that's been released that you want to design a build around. And so an example of this would be the new Varunastra sword that's been released, where all the one-handed weapon types apply to scaling it damage-wise. And so a third type of big idea place where builds come from is they tend to take an existing build, but they want to apply a new tweak on this. And so an example of this might be, instead of using a one-handed and a shield or dual wielding weapons, maybe using, say, a +3 fire staff with damage mods to scale a flame totem or incinerate build instead of those other methods. And so in addition to having really thought of sort of that big idea that's driving your build, you also, in conjunction with that, want to have already thought about how your character is going to be planned offensively and defensively, and what the ideas are that are going to be driving them. And so in addition to this, when you're planning your tree, items and the gems that you're using are going to come into play, and so you want to have thought about them. For example, if you're going to be using like a Belly of the Beast unique chest, well, you might not need to get as much percentage life nodes from the tree that you would if you were just using a rare chest. Additionally, if some of the supports that you're using, and if you're using a lot of them that only have increased damage, or if they don't provide a damage scaling at all, it really puts even more importance on making sure that you pick up those more damage multipliers from the tree whenever possible, such as Elemental Overload for non-crit elemental builds, or Point Blank for those projectile-based attack builds. And so when you come down to planning your tree, what I found useful are really sort of three critical questions. And so the first thing is what are the stats that you want to pick up from the tree? Are you trying to get percent life, percent ES, both? Trying to get percent mana? When you're looking at scaling your damage, are you looking for increased physical damage with claws? Are you looking for increased physical damage with one-handers? Are you looking for weapon elemental damage? What stats are you really trying to get from the tree? And then in conjunction with this, you also have to think about, so how much of each stat is actually necessary for this build? And so I think this is a really critical question, because one of the things that I've seen in looking across many builds is that there's oftentimes a statement of, well, you want as much of this as possible, but there's a problem in planning a tree with that as your target. You don't know when to stop picking it up on the tree. Is 150% life enough? 200? 250? 300? How much do you need? And so without a specified value that you're shooting for, you don't know when you need to stop picking that stat up from the tree, and you can allocate points elsewhere. And a third point that I found that's particularly useful in thinking about the stats that you're trying to acquire is which ones are non-negotiable. Do you absolutely have to have in your build, and which ones are just really nice when you pick them up. So for example, a keystone such as Resolute Technique might be a non-negotiable, whereas maybe the damage scaling, increased physical damage with maces, might be something that you have a little bit of flexibility with, depending upon the strength of your gear, the jewels that you're using, or how many links you have for your support gems. And so what I have found to be the most efficient way and useful way for me, and that's what I want to emphasize here, for me in building passive trees, is stat benchmarks, because they inform me for when I have enough of a stat on a tree and I can allocate points elsewhere, or whenever I don't have enough and I need to figure out how to allocate more points to it. And so the first thing I want to emphasize is that these values that I'm going to share are not absolutes. They are not set in stone. They're going to vary based upon a lot of factors. For example, the person that you talk to can give the people you talk to can give different values. For example, even though there's two hardcore players, depending upon their technical ability, how tanky they like their build to feel, or the stats that they aim for personally, can give you two different sets of stats that they use, even though they both play in a hardcore league. Another influential factor is what skill is being used. So for example, if you're comparing a build that used Earthquake or Ground Slam, which are both melee AoE based attacks, Earthquake is currently stronger in 2.2, and so it would require less damage scaling compared to Ground Slam. You also have to consider the gem links that you're using, both the support gems themselves and how they scale the damage, whether they're using increased or more damage multipliers, or if they even provide any damage scaling, as well as how many of them you have. Are you looking at damage on a 3 or a 4 link that's budget, or are you looking at like once you're decked out in 6 link with a 6 link? And then this also brings up the important point of itemization. The gear that you're using is going to play a major role in informing you how much of each stat do you need from a tree. And what makes this even messier is that jewels can also be inserted into the tree. So even though you've only spent 2 points, the amount of statistics that you're able to pick up from that jewel socket can vary depending upon how strong of a jewel you have, whether you have a 1 property jewel, or a jewel that has 1 useful property, or like a completely decked out 4 property rare jewel. So I want to note that additionally, these are not the only ways to plan a passive skill tree, but they're the ones that I've found the most useful. And so these stat benchmarks that I have here are ones that I've compiled from looking across a variety of builds and talking to a variety of players in both hardcore as well as non-hardcore leagues. So I want to give a bit of background. I'm primarily a life-based, non-crit character builder. So I have the most experience building characters with those type of stats, and it doesn't matter whether I'm using armor or evasion to deal with my plan defensively. I've used both of those to great extent, and used both of them successfully. And so these values that are here in this table, I want to note that they should be taken with a grain of salt. Again, these values are not absolutes, but these are things that, like I said, I found from looking across a variety of builds and talking to a variety of players, or I've used them personally. And even for that life benchmark, one of the things that I've noticed is that I'm 185% life, even though I've commonly seen right around that value referenced, I tend to aim higher than that. I like a bare minimum of 200% increased life from the tree, and I feel even better when it's more like 210 or 220-ish. And that does not include the percent life that you would get from jewels as well, because realistically, I shoot for 7k life as sort of a baseline for what I want to hit with my builds. That's when I really feel like I'm really tanky and strong enough to where I don't die. I also want to note that if you look at the armor and evasion values, there's a whole lot of variation between them, 80% to 200%. And the reason that I put there's so much variation with these is that it depends upon what kind of gear you're using, as well as now, especially like with ascendancies, the passives that you're taking. For example, the Unbreakable Juggernaut ascendancy doubles your body armor, so you might not need as much percent armor scaling on the tree. Or if you're using a one hand and a shield, you might not need as much percent armor scaling from the trees if you have a really heavy armor shield. Similarly with evasion, are you using a shield or not, versus if you're bow and quiver based. It's also important to take into account if you're using things like grace or determination or fortify or dodge or block mechanics. So that's why I have both the percentage values from the tree as well as sort of the actual stat benchmarks you want to search for. And so in terms of offense, I've played both caster builds as well as attack-based builds a fair amount, but what I have up here are assuming that you are a non-crit build, because that's really my biggest background. And so if you're looking at crit-based builds, what I've noticed is that there tends to be a fair amount of variation now, especially again with inclusion of ascendancies like the assassin from the shadow, what kind of gear you have and how much crit chance or crit multi you pick up there, the support gems you're using and how many you have or not, as well as whether or not you're using power charges. Like crit is just a beast with a whole lot of variability built in, because there are just tons of different ways to be able to scale and deal with crit. So again, I want to note that these benchmarks that I have here in this table, they're not absolutes, so take this with a grain of salt. Another common question with the tree is, do I or do I not get jewel sockets? And so if there are 2 passive points, typically you always want to get all of those jewel sockets, because even a solid 2 property jewel is going to give you more efficiency than placing those 2 passive points anywhere else in the tree. If it takes 3 passive points to get to that jewel socket, it depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So if you have a really good 3-stat jewel, chances are you're not going to get the same value out of putting those 3 passive points anywhere else in the tree. And if that happens, then you want to pick up the jewel socket. Or if you need a particular kind of jewel, such as a unique jewel like Rain of Splinters, to make a build work. And that's the closest jewel socket. And then if it takes 4 points to pick them up or more, typically the answer is no. The only exception I can think of this is if you're trying to stack a particular type of stat that's really hard to get on the tree, such as stacking a lot of shock chance or freeze chance, which can be hard to pick up because of its limited availability on the tree. So those are the only kinds of cases that I can think of where basically 4 points would make it worthwhile. And even then, you'd have to compare how much of a change it's going to actually have on your build through some play testing. And so one of the useful metrics that I think is really important to be aware of when you're actually planning your build is comparing 2 different pathing efficiencies, because even though you might hit those benchmarks in your build, one of the ways that you can start to optimize is comparing how much of that stat are you picking up on average per node. And so imagine you're playing a totem-based build, and your build paths both by the Ironwood notable, which occurs in the southwest corner of the passive tree, which is right across from the Blood Magic Keystone, as well as the Shamanistic Fury one, which occurs in the northwest corner between the Templar and Witch starts. And they both take 3 points. They're both totem nodes, and you're wondering, well, which of these should I get? And so if you add up all of the stats that you get for putting the 3 points in each of those clusters, Ironwood's going to give you 38% totem damage, 3% cast speed, 10% totem placement seeds, and it gives you a couple others as well, such as resistances for your totem. But what this calculates to is that basically for each point you're spending in that Ironwood cluster, you're getting a little less than 13% totem damage, about 1% cast speed, and about 3.3% totem placement speed, and that's a per node average. But if you compare this to the Shamanistic Fury cluster, what you notice is that you're getting 16% totem damage per node, as well as 5% totem placement speed per node. And so this information doesn't make the decision for you, but it helps inform you for which cluster might be most useful. For example, if you're a build that doesn't rely upon cast speed, let's say you're an RF totem build, Shamanistic Fury is by far more efficient because you're getting more damage as well as more totem placement speed. And so if you need all of the stats, you just have to consider the relative increases that each of those give you in terms of scaling your damage. And so in closing, I want to note that learning to do this is going to take time and practice. And so to help you be successful with this, what I encourage you to do is look back at builds that you've played that were successful and look at those passive trees and see what types of stats were picked up and how much of each of those stats were acquired. Also, talk to other players and seek feedback on your passive tree. Even if you're having trouble getting feedback from other players, I'd encourage you, after you make your passive tree, set it aside for a little bit, maybe a couple hours, or come back to it the next day and vet it and iterate it again. And through that iteration process, that's where you're going to really refine that tree. Additionally, some of it might take some play testing to just see which really feels better, depending upon the types of statistics that you're trying to pick up from the tree, as well as how does different distributions of points on the passive tree affect your clear speed. I'd also encourage you to get and use a skill tree planner. There's both online and offline versions. I'm going to post a link below the video to an offline version that I use. It's a really, really great tool. So thanks for watching. Good luck with your planning, and I will see you guys around. Take care.